You're about to learn a simple, effective opening for black against the white's first move, pawn e4. On top of that, it's gonna work if white goes pawn d4 instead, just as well. That's how great this opening system is. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and without further ado, let's jump right into it. Let's start with the move pawn e4, because that's the most popular way for white to open up their game. And now in this system, you're gonna play pawn d6 first, just to stop this move from possibly moving forward, because otherwise you would just capture this. Naturally, white would play pawn d4 so that they can build up this strong center, and after that you start to counterattack the white center. You start off with knight f6. So here already there was the first little chance for white to blunder the central pawn, which is being attacked by your knight. So if they just develop casually, then you can go ahead and actually win this pawn for nothing. Now, let's say your opponent is aware of the threat, then he or she will probably defend it with their knight to c3. And actually, if they defend it in any other way, this is not going to change a thing in your setup, because the beauty of this opening is that it's a system. It's not just some opening where you have to memorize different variations. Now, it's a system that you set up against virtually any moves of white. Here, after knight to c3, again, or any other way for white to defend the pawn, you play pawn c6. And we're going to see the purpose of this move in a moment. Now, white would normally develop the other knight to f3, and then you play queen a5. It's a multi-purpose move with a little trick inside. So first of all, if white decides to just continue their development somehow and they overlook the purpose of the move queen a5, let's say they just play bishop e2 or maybe bishop c4 instead. They could have also developed their bishop there. In both of those cases, you're going to take advantage of the pin and just win this central pawn on e4, and in addition to that, you're going to attack this knight on c3. Notice that since the knight is pinned to the white's king, it cannot move, and therefore white cannot recapture in the center of the board, so they just lost the pawn, and they appeared in a bad position. Let's say your opponent noticed the threat, and instead they played bishop to d3 so that this pawn on e4 is being protected. Then you realize another purpose of the move queen a5. You move the central pawn forward, pawn e5, and here we can see that the queen on a5 is doing a great job supporting this pawn so that it cannot be captured by white in case of some sort of an exchange there. Let's say white trades there on e5, and by the way, we're going over the most played moves by white. I've just checked it in the database before recording this video, so we know that that's how your opponents are going to play most frequently. Usually they capture here on e5, even though it's actually a mistake, but they're going to play this anyway because they haven't watched this video. Right, so they're going to take here on e5. You're going to recapture. Now it's quite great for you because you could eliminate this central pawn of white from d4, so now white has no advantage in the center anymore. In addition to that, you've got this open diagonal for your bishop potentially, therefore this exchange favors black, but anyway white plays it. By the way, if white doesn't trade on e5, you're going to be playing the same next moves anyway, because again, it's a setup, not just an opening variation where you have to memorize moves. Okay, what are you going to do next? Well, generally speaking, you're going to bring your bishop out and you're going to castle. Simple moves just to finish your development and to be sure that you're safe and secure. There's one little trick from the white side that you got to know. If they ever play bishop d2, putting this bishop next to your queen, trying to set it up for some sort of discovered attacks, it's always simpler for you just to retreat to safety to this great square on c7. Notice that your pawn from c6 is doing a great job covering these squares so that the white's knight can never go forward and attack your queen. So it's perfectly safe here on c7, it's a great square. And also notice that from here it still supports your central pawn e5, and therefore white can never capture it or else they will lose their knight. So you just, as soon as they move their bishop to d2, trying to somehow attack your queen, you just move it back to safety. Okay, after that, well, probably castle. And then you just simply finalize your development, bishop e7, and at this point they often play something like pawn h3, just to make sure that you don't bring your bishop out to g4. Or again, whatever they do, you're going to be playing the same moves anyway. You just castle, and that's great, because you put your king to safety, and now there's nothing white can do here. They'll play something like queen e2, just to finalize their development. And like, the one thing that I really love about this opening is that there is no clear plan for white, and very often your opponents will find themselves in trouble figuring out what to do after an opening, because it looks like white is standing well. They finished their development, they're fully mobilized, it looks like white's going to be doing good. But if we are just thinking about this more specifically, what is it that white can possibly attack here? How can they even try advancing anyhow? It's pretty hard to figure this out. also notice that this bishop on d3 is quite dull. It's restricted by the white's pawn on e4, and so the bishop looks kind of like a tall pawn within this pawn chain. So the bishop is completely passive. That's one great thing for you. Another great thing about this is that your pawn from c6 is doing a great job restricting this knight on c3. So the knight can never move forward, and basically it becomes also quite a useless piece for white, because there isn't much white can really do with this knight. You know, it can't really move. It can't make any meaningful move, I should say. So the knight becomes rather useless. All in all, it's quite hard for white to figure out how to attack. And what's good for you here is that you just still continue your development. Now, how do you do this? Normally, you would need to bring those minor pieces out. But if we think about development of the bishop, there is a subtle problem here. If you bring it here to e6 right away, white can start possibly to attack it with their knight from g5 and attack this bishop. It's slightly unpleasant. Of course, you could move it back, but anyway, it's a little bit of an unpleasant move for you. So what I recommend doing here instead to develop your pieces is just to start off with the knight and to postpone development of the bishop for a little while, because you will see in a moment that sometimes you don't even need to develop this bishop at all. Okay, I will move, let's say, the rook to the center of the board, and the purpose of your knight standing here on d7 is that you can actually go ahead and move forward to c5 and start putting pressure onto the white's position, onto this bishop, onto the center. And even though right now you could just go ahead and play that move, knight c5, it would be a perfectly fine option for black. It's even better to start expanding on the queen side by playing pawn b5. You just gain more space there. You also restrict the white's pieces further. Now this knight and bishop on d3 just can't move at all. And you also somewhat start harassing white on the queen side, and they might get worried about you possibly moving the pawn forward, attacking the knight, and very often they'll play something like pawn a3. Then you can keep pushing pawn a5, and potentially you're ready to play pawn b4. At some point, you don't have to play right away, but whenever you want, you can start doing that. Let's say they play bishop e3, again, it's the most played move here. Then you can finally land your knight on c5, and you can just overall see that somehow you start outplaying white, because all of the white's pieces are somewhat doing nothing. They're just clueless of what to do here, how to find the right plan, and you just gradually start expanding. Also, your bishop turns out to be a pretty active piece right from its original position, so you may not even need to develop it at all. And the same can be said about the rook from a8. Imagine you go pawn b4 at some point. Let me just execute this. Let's say I place a move and you go pawn b4, right? And after this exchange of pawns, the rook gets active along the a file, and you kick this knight away from c3. So again, your rook becomes really active from its own position, so you save time that you would have spent otherwise to develop this rook somewhere. Now the rook is active, the bishop is active, you start putting pressure onto the white's position, and that's quite a common scenario in this opening, which is quite funny. White plays seemingly proper moves and end up in a bad position, which seems to be like some weird situation which is unexplainable, but that's how very often you're gonna win games here in this opening, playing this as black. And as you can see, you also have a lot of little tricks along the way that your opponent may fall into. Basically, by now you already know everything that you need to know in order to start playing this opening line successfully. And again, just pay attention how universal it is. You can play it against any kind of a setup of white. But nevertheless, let me provide you with some more value, and I want to share with you also some light of how white can possibly challenge you and how you need to react. Here, after pawn e4, we start off with pawn d6, kind of pretending like you're going to play the Pirc defense, but you aren't. After white goes pawn d4, you play knight f6, attacking this pawn in the center. After white protects it however they want, you go pawn c6. And in the previous line, we analyzed the most natural move, knight f3, and the most popular move as well. But in this case, let's see a more challenging approach, pawn f4. More advanced opponents may actually try this stuff against you, and it indeed requires more precision from black, because white is setting it up for some sort of an attack in the center of the board, and you need to know how to deal with this. But of course, no wonder you're playing queen a5, because we're playing the same moves all the time, right? So queen a5 with all the same purpose, you're pinning the knight and threatening to capture this pawn. Therefore, white would still need to defend it, bishop d3, and you still play pawn a5 to block out the white's potential advancement in the center. It's really crucial for you to play this move pawn a5, because if you don't play this, at some point white may say, hey, let me play this move myself and start attacking the knight. So I would definitely recommend that you play this move right after you play queen a5, so you play queen a5, and right after that you make this important advancement so that you block out white from any kind of potential attack. Now, after e5, the pawn on d4 is under an attack, so white would normally need to defend it. And if they actually defend it normally, then you also just finalize your development. You know, bishop e7, castle, and all that standard stuff. I just put too many arrows here. Let me try at least another color. So you just develop your bishop out, you castle, and life's good. But there is one forcing line that you got to be aware of. Some of your opponents will decide, hey, I can actually trade here in the center instead of all that. And now if black decides to capture here with their queen, white would have this extra time to attack this queen with their knight. If queen goes away, maybe white can at some point push the pawn forward, and it really starts looking very, very good for white, because white has a strong potential attack here. And that's how you downplay this as black, okay? So here is the trick. Let's take a move back. Instead of recapturing this pawn with a queen, which gives white a lot of extra temples, you're going to recapture it with the knight. So you go knight g4, and your idea is just to recapture this pawn with the knight, and after that your position is just excellent. In fact, white weakened their position here on the king side for no reason, and it now starts to backfire. Alright, anyway, let's see what happens next. They play knight f3, now you take this pawn, they trade here on e5, and they castle. They still hope for some sort of bishop f4, you know, gaining temples and attacking you. But that's the way for you to play here properly. Bishop d6, you set it up for a nice little trick, queen takes h2, nearly a checkmate. White goes bishop f4 as planned, and you go queen c5 check. Very important check, which allows you to escape without losing time. White has to play king h1, and now you trade the dark square bishops, which is a very good positional decision for you. The white's bishop on d3 is a bad bishop, it's restricted by white's own pawns, it doesn't do anything, and therefore you want to leave white with that passive bishop, and you want to trade off their active dark square bishop. So you trade it off, and now there are multiple ways of how you can proceed here, but I love the move which looks paradoxical, but it's actually a great move in this position. It's the move queen coming here to e5, because as we discussed earlier, this pawn on e4 restricts the white's bishop. If white can ever push it forward, the white's position could become a lot more active, so you want to just block it out right away. And the queen on e5 is a perfect piece. It blocks the pawn, attacks the rook, controls here all the diagonals, you know, all the lines, controls the fifth rank, controls everything, and white cannot do anything. Anyway, let's see what may happen next. Queen f3. Let's say white still insists and say, hey, I want to attack here along the f-file. Then you just play bishop e6, and what's good about this position is that the white's position strategically is actually almost lost. They have the bad bishop, they have this weak pawn on e4, and you're just gonna play knight d7 and castle either kingside or queenside and have a strategically winning position because of these white's weaknesses. But anyway, let's say white tries to rush through and to start some crushing attack. Rook f1, they triple their heavy pieces trying to do something there. You just ignore it and you play knight d7. You could have defended the pawn on f7, but you don't need to, and let me show you some really cool trick here. If white says, hey, I want to break through the defense, I want to sacrifice an exchange, and if black takes with the bishop, I'm going to recapture with my queen with check and start to attack the king. In fact, it's not dangerous, and you could take the rook, it's just single check, there is no big danger there, but there is an absolutely evil refutation of this attempt of white to attack. You just castle. You castle queenside, and it turns out that this rook on f7 is actually trapped, and you're going to take it for free, basically, meaning without giving white any attack, you're going to just win the rook, because it has no way back. If white tries to retreat, you're going to play pawn g5, and as you can see, there are no squares really for the rook available, because if it goes here, you're going to take it with your bishop. If it goes here, you're going to take with the bishop. If it goes here, you're going to take with your knight, and so there is not much that white can do. If it goes here, you just take it with the bishop. All right, so let's take a move back here. That's why after he just castled queenside, the only way for white's rook to try to escape would be rook e7. And after that, there is an inhuman variation which I love just so much. It's very unique, you know, creative, and a great way for black to refute the white's attack. There are multiple ways, because the rook here is still kind of stuck. You just need to attack it, and it would be gone. But here is the most evil way to win the rook. You go rook d to f8, attacking the white's pieces here along the f-file. So white need to move their queen back. Now you trade rooks. And after that, you attack the white's rook with your king. It's an extremely rare case where your king gets involved into the game to attack the rook. Like normally a rook is supposed to attack the king, right? But in this case it's vice versa. The king attacks the rook and it has nowhere to escape, so you're actually gonna go ahead and capture this on the next move. That's really painful for white, and there is nothing white can do. It's really time for white to resign. And I've told you at the very beginning that the same opening setup can be used even against the white's first move, pawn d4. So let me show you real quick how it works in this case. You still play same moves, knight f6, c4, d6, knight c3, pawn c6, white is gonna go e4, hoping for the king's Indian defense, but you still play queen e5, insisting on playing this kind of a setup, still pinning the knight, still threatening to take over here on e4, so it's all the same stuff. If white goes pawn bishop d3 to defend the pawn, you still play pawn e5. Again, it's the system that you play no matter what. You attack the pawn, and now if white takes on e5, it's going to be even better for you compared to what we saw previously, because here the white's pawn is on c4, not on c2, and it weakens the white's position further, because now just notice that along the d file white has a lot of weaknesses. Right now they don't feel it yet, but as soon as you castle and bring your rook over here, white's gonna suffer. Also notice that white has this hole on d4, the weak square which can never be controlled by the white's pawn. Therefore, gradually, after some time, your knight will land there. After some time, of course. Your knight can go knight d7 and then c5, just as we saw previously, and after that it starts to attack this bishop on d3, but it may also decide to change its mind and be brought over here to d4. And as soon as it happens, you're going to dominate in the center and have a great position. So strategically, the white's position is already very risky here, and yeah, you're going to have a great position. Similar to main lines, even in a better situation for you. Now, if white doesn't take here on e5, very often they push their pawn forward to d5. And in this case, there is another little trick that I like to suggest. You could just play bishop e7 and castle, same to the usual variations, and it's perfectly fine. You may play this. But you also have a nice little trick here. You can go knight d7 first. And if white develops their knight somewhere to f3 or whatever, you play knight c5. And here's the thing that white very often overlooks. They think that your intent is to capture the bishop, and so they move it backwards trying to save the bishop. But in this case, you just win this pawn on e4 anyway. So the trick is, white thought that they solved this problem already of defending their pawn on e4, but it's not the case, because the knight is always pinned, so it can never move. So in fact, they could only trade here on e4, they could trade their bishop for your knight, but you still want a pawn at the end of the day, right? Because there was a pawn previously on e4, and now it's gone. Now, what if white does not blunder? If white does not blunder this pawn on e4, and let's say they castle, in this case, you can grab the bishop. And it's great, because bishop, generally speaking, is stronger than a knight, so if you can make this trade, if you can initiate such a trade, it's great for you. And after that, you just continue playing as normal. Bishop e7, you castle, you eliminated this one of the white's powerful bishops, and life's good again, you have a great position. I mean, it's approximately equal, and a computer will often tell you that white is better here, but I've shown you how people actually play it as white. Very often they're clueless of what to do, and they just go down gradually. They're not a computer, so I would not really rely on computer's evaluation here, because it's a complex strategic position. Your opponents aren't ready to play it, they aren't that great strategic players, and very often they're clueless and just play bad moves. That's what they do, and that's how you win a lot of games with the simple and universal opening system. Today we learned a universal and simple, a bit stubborn opening system for black. If you want to know how to play more aggressively as black, I've got another video where I cover a more aggressive and still universal opening for black. Also, if you wish to know how you can advance your chess level overall, you may wish to attend my free masterclass by clicking the link over there. Keep crushing it, talk soon.